It's fast.
Folks online, we'll get started in just 1 minute. There's public committee members running a little.
Thank you, bud. Let's call to order this meeting of the North Carolina Marine Fisheries Commission Habitat and Water Quality Standing Advisory Committee. I think I know all of you. I'm Doug Rader. This is Sarah Gardner. We're members of the commission, and we really appreciate the time, all of you, to come here today. Staff and to set it up and support it. Joel, we're delighted to have received your 1,000-page document and look forward to fully digesting that and being briefed coming up, and hopefully in the meeting in May, so we can really dig into. I called it wisdom before. I'll call it wisdom again. You and your team have shared with us. So you have the agenda and the minutes before you that you had delivered and have had in a timely way. So I ask for a motion to approve the agenda as it sits in front of you. If someone, Scott, a second.
So
Mark, any opposition will go forward as proposed. Second item, you have the minutes from the last meeting in front of you. I hope you've had a chance to digest those. I'll accept or take a motion to approve those minutes. Okay, Mark, second by Scott. Why not? Any dissent? Without dissent, those are adopted. And again, as I've said before, if you find that any small error, inconsequential errors that you would simply get corrected, please let the staff know, and we'll make sure that is reflected. So moving on, we have public comment scheduled now. I don't know if there's anybody online that wants to talk or anybody in the audience, but we'll open it up now to public comment.
I think we do have at least one member of the public in attendance. Would you like to provide any public comments, sir?
Okay, we look forward if that should change, let me know. We can talk about what you're interested in. Okay, given that, we'll move on to our two discussion topics for tonight. The first has to do with the In my view, both of these are extraordinarily important things, both to talk about tonight and then to begin weighing in on in a more detailed way as each of the processes runs its course. So first, the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan amendment that is underway, and we'll be briefed by Charlie on that. And then the second has to do with the deepwater oyster recovery areas that were put in place by the commission recently, but obviously we're on the front end of a longer process to clarify what the potential is for those to support the habitats, to support the ecosystems and fisheries writ large of coastal North Carolina. And so we'll discuss that second and then take up any other issues that you wish to address. So Charlie, can I turn it to you?
Absolutely. Thanks, Doug. And if y'all can't hear me at the back, feel free to interrupt me at any point and tell me to speak. So I'm Charlie Deaton. I'm the Habitat Protection Supervisor here at DMF, and I'm going to be talking about the 2026 update to the CHIP today. So as a reminder of what the CHIP is, the CHIP was born out of the 1997 Fisheries Reform Act. The goal is long-term enhancement of coastal fisheries by addressing habitat and water quality needs. And we are required to work with staff from DMF, Division of Coastal Management, and the Division of Water Resources to help develop the plan. And we normally also involve a wider range of stakeholders as well. And the plan gets approved not just by the Marine Fisheries Commission, but also Coastal Resources Commission and Environmental Management Commission. So it's pretty special in that we're required to bring in all of these different perspectives and address habitat issues on a very holistic way. So we're currently in the early stages of drafting the 2026 CHIP. And I'm going to be presenting to you the framework that we developed by working with our partners at all these different divisions over the past year or so. We've started the process of doing a little bit of the writing here, but our goal here today is get feedback from you guys on any parts of this that you think are especially important and we should emphasize, or anything that you think we're leaving out and we need to do a better job of addressing. So while we're in progress here, things aren't set in stone, so there's still some room to bring some things in. So appreciate any feedback that you have as we go through this. So looking back in the past, looking at CHIP accomplishments from before, the CHIP's had a role in developing general permits for living shorelines, making it easier for the public to get permits to put in these greener erosion protection solutions. It had a role in the passage of the coastal stormwater rules that protect water quality in our coastal watersheds. It's informed the way we do oyster restoration and habitat mapping, and it's put emphasis on developing strategic habitat areas, which you'll hear a little bit more about later on today. So the 2021 CHIP, the most recent CHIP, was amendment. So what that means is the 2016 Coastal Habitat Protection Plan is what we call the base plan. 2021 is an amendment. 2026 will also be an amendment. And so all that practically means is that all the recommended actions from all the previous CHIPs are still active. We're still working towards progress from issues from 2016 because some of these issues are taking a while to work on. But so in 2021, the big focus areas were water quality benefits for our submerged aquatic vegetation habitats, nature-based solutions for wetland protection, improving our habitat monitoring, improving rule compliance, and starting to address some wastewater infrastructure impacts. And we also had, for the first time, a cross-cutting chapter on the impacts of climate change. So in 2026, we are building on a lot of those themes. So ecosystem-based management is something that calls back to the 2016 CHIP. The SAV protection and restoration theme and planning for multi-decadal wetland change both build on the issues I just talked about from the 2021 CHIP. And this community engagement piece is one that we see as a cross-cutting theme that'll go across all the work that we do. So as we go through this, you'll see some of these colored icons next to our proposed actions. We have 22 actions that came through on our initial list of proposed actions. That number will probably change as we finish writing it out. But some of these will be done with the passage of the CHIP in November 2026, I guess November of this year. And others will be kind of a roadmap to where we're going from here. So just keep that in mind. Not everything that some of this is a commitment to do things in the future. So getting into the first theme, which is ecosystem-based management. That's something that's come up in previous editions of the CHIP for a long time. And the goal being incorporating the entire ecosystem into resource management decisions. So moving from individual species assessment to bringing in the human, biological, physical components linked together and understanding that those impacts carry across to different sectors. So one approach to that is called integrated ecosystem assessments. That's developed and implemented by NOAA for many regions of the coastal US, notably not the South Atlantic region where we are. But this framework was discussed in the 2016 CHIP and also discussed in the collaboratory report. But the short of the process is that managers would kind of define our ecosystem and management goals. We would develop indicators to monitor and assess the ecosystem itself, and then use those indicators to understand long-term trends and be able to test and evaluate management strategies. So in North Carolina, APNEP, the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership, they've done some work with this method using indicator-based approaches for their comprehensive ecosystem assessment. And the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council's Habitat and Ecosystem Advisory Panel also has an interest in trying to get this moved at the federal level too. So we envision kind of discussing this again, bringing in some of the discussion from the collaboratory report that looked at a very broad suite of indicators and collected a massive amount of data. And then putting together a workshop and a work group to start to develop, how are we going to handle this? How are we going to move forward with this? And summarizing some additional mapping and habitat data we've collected in the meantime. So I include this as an image of what reporting of this IEA approach can look like. This is the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council's State of the Ecosystem report, or a snapshot of it, where they bring in, I wouldn't try to read all the text on this slide, by the way, but the highlights are, you've got these indicators on the left side, quick overview of the trends and current statuses, and a brief discussion of the implications. They bring in some observations from the fishing fleet and a look at changing climate conditions. So there's a lot of data that can go into this, and it can be pretty resource intensive, but these products are really cool and a great way to communicate what's happening with the ecosystem to folks making decisions. So we might not wind up with something exactly like this, but this is kind of the direction we think would be cool to move in. The second prong of the ecosystem-based management work is going to be looking at strategic habitat areas, which those of you who've been around for a while have probably heard for a long time. But those came from the first edition of the CHIP. Go to the next slide. And the goal being to identify locations with high quality connected habitat that can be used to protect biodiversity and ecological function. Four primary criteria that went into them were high ecological function, being relatively unaltered, landscape connections, and in need of protection. So staff used a conservation planning tool to incorporate all those criteria along with expert input to nominate a network of habitat areas across the coast. And the last of those were approved in 2018 by the MFC. So once those nominations were completed, the MFC requested field validation for those regions to confirm, like, okay, are these actually more productive, more diverse? And so for the southern half of the coast from Carteret County down, that field sampling has been completed, and we are going to present the final analysis of that data with this edition of the chip. We'll also be discussing rather than having a whole nother field study to evaluate the northern regions, we're going to try to reuse existing DMF data as much as possible to evaluate the SHAs from the, strategic habitat areas, or SHAs as we always wind up abbreviating them to, from the northern half of the state. And the goal with the strategic habitat areas, once they eventually get proposed for going into rule, has been to attach non-regulatory management options and strategies for them. So that can be things like prioritizing adjacent watershed areas for land acquisition through conservation planning, and maybe improved grant scoring for restoration projects in these areas. So that's kind of the eventual down the road approach that we're moving towards with these. Switching gears to SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation protection and restoration. We want to continue building on some of the water clarity improvement work that we started in the 2021 chip. In short, increasing nutrient delivery to the estuaries is driving increased phytoplankton growth, in addition to additional sediment loading and organic matter washout into the estuaries. This is all decreasing the light available to our seagrasses. So the 2021 chip recommended that the Division of Water Resources Nutrient Criteria Development Plan team develop water clarity standards in association with the Scientific Advisory Council. That work was completed, and now that recommended water clarity standard is stepping through the regulatory steps before it gets to the Environmental Management Commission for a vote. At this point, that's been delayed quite a few times. The Environmental Management Commission's had plenty of other things on its plate, like PFAS. So that vote has been delayed. I need to update this slide now to 2027. But they are expecting to receive an informational update later this year. So this is running behind from goals from the 2021 chip. It was the biggest thrust of what we wanted to get done that year, and remains a high priority for us. So this is one that we hear a lot about, and we want to continue working on. And while we continue to advance that through the Environmental Management Commission, we are on the side hoping to summarize some existing clarity data collection efforts and what they've found, and try to kind of get ahead of it and be able to describe a little better where these problem areas are most concentrated, and start to specifically lay out some research needs in terms of identifying sources and pieces of that clarity degradation. So the SAV chapter, as we're envisioning it, has three pieces. The second piece is going to be continuing work that started with the Shrimp Amendment 2 back in 2023, where DMF presented some shrimp trawl restriction proposals to the Marine Fisheries Commission. And in short, basically, after going through that with stakeholders for a year, we were directed to go and take a broader look at things rather than singling out one group of stakeholders. So we have gone back and started to summarize what the MFC's powers are, what its legal authority is, and kind of taking a broader view of what's the widest reach we could take, the most broad approaches to SAV protection within the Commission's wheelhouse. So that'll be coming through, and we'll be considering it as well from perspectives that go beyond just our SAV habitats, and thinking about what the Commission's powers are going to be and its authority are for rulemaking in general as it pertains to the chip. We'll also start to look at, and that could include potential rule changes. It could include protections from physical disruption. It could potentially address the SAV definition. There's been some discussion of the time frame component of that definition, basically saying if SAV has been surveyed in the past 10 years, it can be seen as SAV habitat. It's known to grow there. because SAV doesn't grow in the same place every 10 years out of 10 years. So that time period is in there to ensure that it's protected, even if, someone goes to build a dock over it in that 1 year when it's not growing there out of 10 years. But given that we don't have surveying of the coast every year, some places on the coast, particularly the low salinity parts of the rivers, Currituck Sound, places like that, we don't have a survey within the last 10 years. So trying to change some of the way we approach this to ensure that everywhere is protected equally. And then also looking at some non-rulemaking management strategies, potentially SAV restoration leases, and trying to further reduce it from shellfish lease. And the third part of our SAV chapter is going to be looking at roadblocks to active restoration of SAV. This is something that has been a growing point of discussion, both in the research and restoration communities. In 2021, through the CHIP, DEQ committed to protecting and restoring 191,000 acres of SAV statewide. And so we're going to have to, we're still losing SAV. So step one is stopping the loss, and step two is going to be going the other way and getting some SAV back out there. So we'll be trying to identify barriers to restoration, and looking at siting, permitting, planting, and looking at some of the regulatory hurdles there. And we're going to hopefully work on a series of workshops and a working group to dive into these roadblocks, and start to identify some priority recovery areas where we might be able to get the ball rolling on this. All right, and moving out of SAV into wetland change. This third theme of the 2026 CHIP is really carefully building on the 2021 chapter on wetlands, where basically in 2021 we said there's a lot happening with climate change and our coastal wetlands, a lot of impacts from sea level rise, and a lot of work going on by our partners. So in 2021, we punted a little bit and said, we're going to work with partners on planning for all these potential impacts and understanding them a little better. So here in 2026, we're going to build a little bit upon that work. Little overview first. As sea level rises, this being one of the biggest threats to our coastal wetlands, there's the potential for where marsh vertical accretion, marshes trap sediment naturally. If they can't trap enough to keep up with sea level rise, those marshes will drown. But at the same time, as sea level rises, that's flooding new uplands, and so that's new potential marsh habitat. So you have this potential to both lose marshes in some areas and gain it in others. And so the short version of that is we expect to see a lot of places with kind of winners and losers in terms of where salt marsh is going to be going forward. And one of the efforts from 2021 is we worked with the North Carolina Coastal Federation on their salt marsh action plan, which brought in a lot of the latest science on how climate change is going to affect these wetlands, and started to highlight some of what we might be able to do to address that. So we are going to look at some of what went into that salt marsh action plan. We're going to summarize some of the marsh migration projections and where we expect to see some of that new marsh, where we might be losing some marsh, and talk about what kind of planning scenario might look like for that. And then continue to work with partners and start to look at prioritizing some conservation funded projects to make sure that we're addressing this, because, as a property owner, there's a lot of questions when the marsh starts to creep into your backyard. From us as habitat people, we see that as good. You as a landowner might, see that as not something that you want. You don't necessarily want to tie it up in your yard. So there's a lot of discussion into how to best enhance conservation of these wetlands and make sure that landowners and developers can address this with the sensitivity that it deserves. So the other end of this is, that's talking about new marshes with marsh migration. As we start to lose marshes on the other end, there are some developing tools to use to start to try to slow that loss. One of them we call thin layer placement. And that, as the name suggests, means putting a thin layer onto the marsh. This would be a thin layer of sediment. So in this figure on the right, you can see in the bottom right panel, as sea level rises, they've added this thin layer of sediment. And by thin, we typically mean somewhere in the range of a couple inches up to maybe a foot in some cases. So not a lot of dirt, but enough to offset potentially a decade or two of sea level rise. The issue is currently that's not allowed by Coastal Resources Commission rules. You can't fill wetlands. That was part of the point of the Dredge and Fill Act. And so currently the only way to permit this is through a variance through the CRC. We understand that they're interested in seeing a few cases of this marsh restoration technique come through and then to start developing a permit for that. So we are at the very, very early stages of potentially developing a permitting process for this restoration technique. And there's a picture of what that looks like here. This is one method where they can spray a slurry out of sediment onto the marsh. There are other methods that are a little less showy, I guess. Anyway, so we're trying to summarize the latest science, and we're trying to look at what other states are doing with this issue. Other states, some of them are farther along than us. Some other states are in the same place. So we're looking to look at best lessons from those other states in terms of permitting and what issues they've seen, what best practices they can recommend. And then we actually have a workshop coming up in about a week and a half where we're bringing together a bunch of folk from the divisions of coastal management and water resources and some other regulatory agencies, and having a chance to talk about some of the latest science and getting a few perspectives from other states. So the ball is rolling on this workshop action already, and we're hoping to keep that moving along because there's already some nonprofit agencies that are starting to come in and really want to do this restoration technique here in North Carolina. And the last part is this cross-cutting community engagement theme. So we don't necessarily have any actions that are falling under this immediately. And this is largely going to serve as kind of an information paper. And ultimately, it may get broken out from an information paper into just tailoring each individual section as appropriate. So anyway, the main topic is going to be exploring how DEQ's community engagement program and its Office of Resilience can fit into coastal habitat protection work. The community engagement program produces the community mapping system, which is pictured here. And that system identifies potentially underserved communities across the state. And that program then helps DEQ divisions with outreach to those communities. So we're really talking about habitat restoration and community resilience opportunities in these underserved communities. So this will be building on existing DEQ efforts, particularly information from the 2020 Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan, and focusing on connecting specific social vulnerabilities to specific threats to coastal habitats, along with opportunities to address that connection through habitat restoration and resilience work. So I tend to use the example of salt marsh expansion with sea level rise as an example. So there are plenty of folks who are already starting to kind of see salt marshes expand into their backyards. And some places like Wilmington have the resources to help landowners address this, but not everywhere has those resources. And so starting to explore what it might look like to engage some of those less resourced communities on issues like this as they start to see these big environmental changes coming up in the future. So we're wrapping up now with the timeline for moving forward. We are currently developing these issue papers in partnership with partners across DEQ and bringing in a few folks from outside agencies. And we are going to keep checking back in with our interagency CHIP team and our CHIP steering committee. And we will be available to come back to this advisory committee and other committees with updates if there's continued interest. And we're trying to have a complete draft of the CHIP done by the end of the summer for advisory committees and commissions to review and get it out in time for public comment ahead of final adoption in November. So I'll just leave this up as our last slide. That's the 2026 CHIP in a nutshell. So at this point, if anyone has any questions, I would be more than happy to try to answer them.
Personally, I always have about 800 or 900 questions for Charlie.
I see your barriers pertain more to data acquisition than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you obtaining your data from?
Any specific area that you're interested in?
Well, you know, I come from way back when Stan Riggs was still at ECU, and I flew him all up and down the coast developing different films and stuff so we could do data and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a plethora of satellite data that is available to you. I mean, high resolution satellite data that'll get you, and I noticed one you were looking for was chlorophyll.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very highly available situation that takes it down to 3 feet square. Same thing for the seagrass. So I'm just wondering, is it not being acquired or, because like I said, those 2 roadblocks I saw coming from that acquisition of data.
Yeah. So some of that is there's data out there and figuring out how to use it in a management application. And some of it is we need more data or we need more people to process it. So, you know, our seagrass mapping right now is mostly done by our partners at APNEP, the Albemarle Pamlico National Estuary Partnership. And they get up there, they contract usually DOT to fly planes and collect imagery. And then they're doing in-water sampling to complement that and ground truth it. Now the satellite chlorophyll stuff is something that I haven't actually thought about. Now that you say that, I've heard of it and it's not something I've looked into, but that's definitely something that is a good, like, that's exactly some of the feedback that I'm hoping to get of like, oh, yeah. I should be looking at that.
Because, you know, I come from time when Landsat was first, you know, started and everything, and that's what I out of school I was going to do, but I didn't ever go the other way. But beside the point, there is a, you know, from my experience and everything when I was doing it was you had the data, but you got to proof the data, which, you know, you only have sort of a limited amount of funds in this program. So if we can acquire the data from federal agencies and stuff like that, which is readily available, you just got to comb through to get to the one you need. Mm-hmm. And then spend the money within here ground proofing what you've got to make sure that what you're seeing is what, you know, actuality is, which is, you know, statistically just sampling. That was my question, because I think, you know, it's more readily available than you think.
Yeah. And it's a good reminder to look broadly and to cast a wide net for making sure we're getting to that data.
Well, like I said, data comes so broad from the, you know, from the areas and stuff like that, to refine it down to it. It takes, you know, to find that, but there are people in the area that can do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
Question, Sarah?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the water clarity standards that we're trying to get?
Sure. So with the 2021 CHIP and the development of it, and I'm gonna probably butcher some of the details, but I don't think anyone here is involved in that process, so no one will call me out on it. But before I was here, the habitat protection team and partners across the EU really identified water clarity degradation as an issue, being that there's not enough light getting to our seagrasses. And particularly our lower salinity seagrasses up in the Neuse and Pamlico rivers, the Albemarle Sound, Currituck Sound. And Nathan Hall, who couldn't be here tonight, could get into the nuts and bolts of what the different components of that clarity are a lot better than I can. But a lot of the three main sources of that are it's sediments that are stirred up in the water, it's phytoplankton growth, algal growth, which itself tends to be driven by nutrient input. And the third part is CDOM, which is dissolved organic matter, think like tannic water. So between those three different sources, the depth that enough light gets through for seagrasses to grow is getting shallower. So we're losing those deeper water seagrasses as the water gets darker. And so in identifying that as a problem, staff at the time said, okay, what we need to do is put in a standard in place. They looked at what Virginia had done in the Chesapeake Bay. They looked at what Florida had done in Tampa Bay, and a few other examples, and decided that this regulatory approach, we need to, we're not going to get there through voluntary restoration and best management practices. We need to take a stronger approach to this. And so that's where they went to water quality standards. And at the time they proposed first a clarity standard and then an improvement to the existing chlorophyll standard and eventually getting to nitrogen and phosphorus standards. So for the time being, we're focused on the clarity standard. That was step number one, and that's still what we're hung up on. The CHIP recommended targets for a light extinction coefficient. So basically how quickly the light disappears as it goes down through the water. And that's something that can be directly measured with a meter. That was recommended through the CHIP. The Scientific Advisory Council that was convened also recommended that number and recommended it be applied one coefficient for low salinity systems and one for high salinity systems. That was based on the difference in the biology of those systems. The low salinity grasses are actually used to having less clear water because those systems are just darker and more turbid. So slightly different numbers, but statewide application. And so that document has now gone to a CIC, Criteria Implementation Committee. So basically that gives stakeholders who would be impacted by the proposed standard a chance to say, hey, this is going to cause X cost for me if you implement this. And then the Division of Water Resources economists will compile all of their input and develop a fiscal note and say, okay, here's the standard and here's the potential cost to implement it. And so that's the stuff that we're at right now. They have one economist who's working on quite a few things and I think just came back from maternity leave. So they are working on the fiscal note for this rule, and that package, I suppose, will eventually, we're looking at 2027 now for the EMC to get that whole package together.
I think it's probably worth taking a minute to think about the process and how ours, this committee and this commission interacts with the other commissions, staffs, and obligations. Because clearly, most of these things don't operate in a vacuum. And in fact, they mostly operate as delegated processes supported by state law that implements them, but delegated processes from the federal government. So the Coastal Zone Management Act here, Coastal Area Management Act, is part and parcel to the Coastal Zone Management Act federally. Our water quality laws and rules do the same thing with the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, and et cetera. And for that matter, our fisheries regulations are very much integrated back at higher scales to the Magnuson Act and its authorizations, including the coastal habitat protection requirements of that. So just for instance, once this is adopted by these three commissions, clearly a lot of the outcomes that we're trying to manage for are difficult to achieve by ourselves here in North Carolina. And so those typically would then spill up into those regional protection plans with the regional councils. So for instance, the South Atlantic Fisheries Management Council has probably 1,000-page habitat. I don't know how many pages it is. I don't know if it's been printed in a long time, but it's massive, but it's not standalone from this. The documents are interactive, and this, as it's completed, will roll up into that, along with those similar documents where they exist from the other states south of here. Remember that North Carolina goes north and south in the fisheries context. But then it's also the case that a lot of the programs that the EMC or we or the CRC would adopt have similar parallel leverage on federal processes. So once something becomes essential fish habitat in the federal parlance, having been adopted by the South Atlantic or Middle Atlantic Council or by the Secretary of the Department of Commerce, then that actually has direct action impact on federal activities and permits and funding that might be the checkpoint in limiting implementation changes. So, for instance, wetland permits are federal and sometimes delegated state permits. Discharge permits and non-discharge permits for wastewater similarly. Coastal Area Management Act things interact in other ways. And so things that may seem arcane or maybe even academic here have the potential to cascade all the way through. So the one that Charlie was just talking about, let's say that the EMC adopts a water clarity standard. So what happens then is if that standard is not met in the waters by monitoring programs, then that water can be identified as impaired, meaning that its beneficial uses are not met. It can end up on what's called the 303D list, which is a federal list that the state of North Carolina supports in terms of data collection, but EPA administers. And then once it ends up there, meaning that the standards that support the beneficial uses are not being met, then that can induce mandatory actions to remediate those violations of those standards. And at that point, the process can get very formal. There can be it's called a total maximum daily load or TMDL plan required to remediate impaired waters listed on the 303D list. So at that point, that requires very specific actions to redress the sources that can be redressed. Now, if you're looking at actions that aren't, then you might not. But just for instance, the plans to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus inputs into nutrient-sensitive waters in North Carolina came through that pathway, having been identified for failure to meet chlorophyll and also dissolved oxygen standards in the Chowan and the Tarapamico and the Neuse and the Upper Cape Fear. Is that all? Maybe. Anyway, so I'm not trying to get into the point is this can get balls rolling. And just one more, and I think this is important to think about as we move into the DORA discussion, and I'll push back maybe a little on that with you later, Charlie, but once the Marine Fisheries Commission really doesn't have the authority to do anything much outside of the direct management of fisheries. And this CHIP process was created in order to develop momentum for the three commissions to work together under their aegis, under the purview of things that they are allowed to do. And by extrapolation, the portal that they create into some federal actions that might be required to be parallel to that, or funding actions in partnership that might be required to redress problems in that case. So one example is when the Marine Fisheries Commission first identified primary and secondary nursery areas. And remember, in North Carolina, those are the places that nearshore spawning things like many finfish and crabs and shrimp and things settle initially. They're primary in their life history, where the larvae first settled down up into the upper reaches of tidal creeks, and identified those. We didn't have the authority. It wasn't a we, but the commission didn't have the authority to mandate anything about water quality or land use or anything beyond physical disturbance by activities under our aegis. And so that means fishing, basically. And they did that. But those then created impetus for the Coastal Resources Commission and the Environmental Management Commission to look at the way that water quality standards were set in those places and the way that activities under their purview, so development activities or discharge activities or other things, were then regulated. So it actually creates, in addition to the non-regulatory approaches that Charlie was talking about, I would just call it a regulatory cascade that identifies who needs to do what and how, and it takes time to make it happen, but it can. And so all of the, like the SHAs, for instance, are based on what's there in the water, as opposed to where you might really want to end up in terms of the total distribution of those kinds of habitats. But we could get there. We could identify actually what a full portfolio by amount and place and location of different types of habitats might look like, where that portfolio might be being blocked by some set of activities that might be remediated and go forward that way. So I do think that the spatial identification of existing or potential high value habitats really can start rolling here and through the CHIP with the staff, and then through the 3 commissions, and then from there figure out how you get there and what is it that you need, that needs to be done, and by whom, what tools are available in the toolbox, what kind of resources do you need, all that kind of stuff. So I don't know how long it took from the very first action on primary nursery areas. That must have been in the 80s, 80s,
70s, 80s.
70s
or 80s.
When they were established.
Yeah, something like
It was in the 70s.
Yeah, something like that. So, but yeah, that took stages and even generations of membership on these things. Joel.
Maybe I want to finish with the P&As. And I think maybe, I don't know if I have a question, but I may have like 3 like challenges for you to think about. And I mean, very sincerely, I don't think anybody's more impressed by the CHIP existing than me. Like, it's a very unique document that I think we can be proud of. It has been a foundation, but now it's been a foundation for like, let's say 20 years, coming up on 20 years. And I think we're not realizing the intent of the CHIP through the FRA, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So the first point is when I look at the FRA, it has 4 things with the CHIP. Number 1 is you're supposed to classify, and you're kind of doing that. One of them is you're supposed to identify threats, and I think you do that pretty well, the general you. There's some words about restoration. So okay, that kind of. The missing piece is the FRA demands that you establish the function of the habitats for fisheries. And there, I think we're still lost in the wilderness. And I think the CHIP needs to guide us either aspirationally or functionally towards a pathway that we can do that. So for instance, what do I mean by that? I mean that in terms of the high salinity seagrasses, I'm going to say since 2006, that mapping, let's say we've lost 20,000 acres. So the 26 to 2013 said 10,000 acres. They don't actually count the seagrass that may have been lost as it went from contiguous to patchy. That's a perhaps hidden missing piece. But we've lost 20,000 acres of seagrass. And I'm going to say, and feel free to push back, nobody here can tell you how that's affected fish. I spend a lot of my, day job trying to explore things like that, and it's still a big challenge. Mm-hmm. So spots settle in the seagrass, the high salinity seagrass. They're there in huge numbers in March, and then they're gone because they're moving up into brackish waters. Blue crabs and shrimp are in the grass, the high salinity grass. And we are at a point where we can't say, okay, well, this is what's affecting blue crab numbers. So in tandem with harvest or other, processes, like this is the functional effect of losing seagrass. And if we can't do that, how can we expect the statute makers in the state to want to spend the money? Because talk about expensive. Or to pass the statutes, I won't say rules, maybe there's some rules too, with the commission that would guide us back towards more seagrass. So I think the CHIP needs to be much more powerful in us understanding the functional relationship, So DMF doesn't even sample for little crabs and fishes and shrimp in low salinity SAV. How do you do it? It's hard to do. So there's not actually any sampling to look at the functional role of that habitat. Mm. So if there's a point there, I think number 2 in the list of things the CHIP is supposed to do is establish the functions. And we live in a quasi-religion. Habitat is important. but no one can tell you X amount of habitat equals X amount of crabs. And so how are you going to motivate people to want to restore it when we can't even ballpark that? I think that's a huge problem. Number two is that, and I'm like the millionth person to say this, is the chip needs to be much more specific about the teeth that this thing needs.
Mhm.
And until we get there, this thing is going to cycle back as nice little pieces, but not really the core issue here. And there's a couple ways, to have teeth. So for instance, I mean, it does amaze me that we don't even have a stock assessment for oysters.
Mhm.
If you can't get a stock assessment for oysters, how are you going to do finfish that move around much more? And we don't even have a framework for something like a stock assessment for seagrass. There is no stock assessment for seagrass. If blue crabs are overfished or overfishing is occurring, the state must, you shall, do something. There is nothing equivalent for seagrass, as an example. It has different forms of protection for sure,
Mhm.
but nothing that puts it in your face in the same way. Or you could integrate habitat more directly into the stock assessments of other species. And there's ways to do that that aren't being done. And so the chip should be guiding us there. So that's number two. And then number three is, I am amazed, a little disappointed, I'll say, although we're all in this together, that when I looked at the 2016 and 2021 version of the chip, it's shocking how little P&As are mentioned.
Yeah.
I think in the 2020, I don't remember if it's 2026, I think it's mentioned 7 times,
Mhm.
and 4 of those are in references. And so I think there needs to be a whole chapter in the chip about P&As. So, having explored those data, like they're not supporting critters at the same rate at all. We're seeing like a long-term decline, and whether that's sedimentation or water quality or something else, like if you want to think of the P&As as a habitat in and of themselves, they're being degraded in a way that's different than being able to say, well, that's seagrass. Like P&As are kind of an amalgam of things. I think there needs to be a whole focus just on P&As that's not currently appearing in the chip.
So that's very well said for me personally. I agree with you. And in fact, I'm one of the people that wrote that language in the chip law, that part of the law. And I think what we thought would happen is that there actually would be improving science through time and goal setting in the same way that what they did basically on wetlands nationally was say, well, we don't know how much wetlands we need of different types, but we know we can't afford to lose more. And so therefore it became a no net loss as an interim measure of overall performance. That actually kind of took on a life of its own and looked at weighted offsets and things like that that didn't always do the job, but nonetheless, that was an interim measure of performance. How are we doing? And I personally believe for a time it slowed the loss, and that coupled to a lot of other things for coastal wetlands really brought the level of loss down significantly. But we're at a point now where I don't think we're actually, I think AppNet probably tracks or monitors some of these things, but that's not yet connected back in directly into the chip. I don't know what our process would be for goal setting for adding how many acres and where of this, that, and the other does it take to support fully rebuilt populations and their life history for each of the species they were managing and their prey in order to bring your ecosystem-based management dreams, both of you, to reality. But I think we could come up with interim measures that are based on best available science and best professional judgment of relative prevalence and trends in different habitat compartments, not one at a time, but each and every one. And so as we move into this oyster discussion in a moment, I'm just going to assert that one of our least well-represented habitats, critically important habitats, is deeper water, higher relief oyster reefs that were critical to, especially in a degraded estuary where bottom DO it's causing traumatic mortality on early life history stages or medium life history stages of a wide variety of species. And I don't think we can ever get to the right answer by looking at it through the lens of an individual species, including oysters, just to be clear. So if we wanted to say how big is that need, I would say that we're close to zero if you compare it to pre-1880s prevalence for high relief oysters. Staff, I think, agrees more or less. The commission certainly agreed. And now how we get from where we are now to there is I think what's going to be on the table in a minute. But I would love to see some motion either here or initiate motion towards accounting systems for habitats. Scott?
Kind of to go along with what his points were on the current chip. So we're at a 10-year study where we said we're going to study and evaluate and plan. And then we're going to plan for more studying and evaluating for protection from loss. And I'm hoping that this addition of the next version of the chip will have something that is restorative actions, not just waiting for nature to take its course. So a lot of the actions, okay, we're going to set aside so many acres, but we're not doing anything to mitigate and to really restore what's going on. Will within this next amendment, will it have some action items like that where we're actually it's gonna outline, we're gonna replant or we're gonna spawn new or, do something that is an action that I think a lot of us have seen from a doc. We don't want to see another 5-year study where we're just studying. We're hoping that for the last 20 years, last 10 years, last 5 years, that research has resulted in something that where we can say we need to do this next step. Will this next amendment have something like that?
So the closest is going to be what we're going to do with our SAV restoration discussion. So the Nature Conservancy and a private company out of Florida are working with wanting to do some of that work here in North Carolina. So some of what we're looking at, and I know Joel has a big research.
That's Sea and Shore you're talking about?
Sea and Shoreline, yeah. And they do a lot of work in Florida now. They've come to us a couple times to discuss kind of the regulatory framework and the pieces that are and are not needed to change to make this happen. And so part of the goal here being for us to outline, okay, here's what you need permit wise, because this isn't something that's really been extensively tested in the state. And there's going to be, administrations change politically, and there are times when we'll have grant money for restoration. There are times we don't. There's not so much right now, but at some point the thought is there's going to be more money coming down the pipeline to do a lot more of this restoration. Let's be ready for it. Let's get the permit in order. If we need to make any rulemaking changes, let's get that started now. So that, I wish I could say that in November 2026, when this is passed, DMF staff are going to be out there planting seagrass.
Right.
Not right now, but we are. And I think that's this and some of our discussion a minute ago is a good reminder, I think, to us as the staff to make sure that we're putting the progress chart out here and saying this will lead, this regulatory reform or this data collection will lead to this regulatory reform to this on the ground action.
Right.
I'm interested in Joel's underlying comment, which to me is it's been a lot of years and how much progress have we made? And by that, I don't mean policy progress, which is important, but outcome progress in terms of actually changing, improving either stop loss or slowing rates of loss, which I don't think we really know, much less reversing it. And to me, actually, the word restoration, Scott, is interesting, but I think we're managing forward with a lot of drivers that are affecting these systems towards a better state. And I'm doubtful that we'll restore much from what used to be there a long time ago. And although it might well be that oysters in the deeper water is something where we could, if we could get that system going, we actually could literally restore something that would have a chance of being there once we got it restored. if we could address the water quality challenges, other things that aren't yet addressed. But nonetheless, I don't think we're tracking, I don't think we really know what the bottom line is of this 3-commission department-wide endeavor at this point.
And that's kind of where the teeth of the document, like at the end of this next 5-year cycle, will it have definitives? We will make a determination. Will we come to it and not just be another study for another 5 years?
Well, I'm a part-time resident in Florida, and you're talking about some of the studies in Florida. Florida has been doing studies for years. But what it finally came down to with them was, we want to see some goal settings. If you want the money to fund these projects and stuff like that, we want to see no more studying. We want to see what you're going to do if we give you this funding to some actions. And I think that's what you need to put in the chip. Because, like I said, you got 20 years study behind you. And every time it comes up every 5 years, it's kind of, well, let's study some more, and we got this, and that's part of it. But we also need, legislature's gonna be looking at, the money's going to something like they can tell the public that this is happening. It's like, restoration of seagrass, oyster restoration, or something project. So they right now in Florida, right where my place is, they just did 20 acres of seagrass restoration. All over the news. Stannis was glad to put his name on it, tell them we need to do more.
Mhm.
That's where you're gonna get your funding. That's where you're gonna, because it needs to be in this chip. Like I said, 20 years behind.
That's some in some of the plans, right? Like the oyster and hard clam plan for.
Sure, yeah, and the oyster restoration and enhancement
Mhm.
activities broadly, I
Yeah.
think that's a case point where the legislature can say, here's $2 million, and we can tell you this many acres of sanctuary, this many acres of coal.
But like I
this
said,
many ships
like I said, it needs to be more goal setting involved in it. You've done 20 years of, we're looking at this, we're looking at this, we're looking at this, but there hasn't been anything placed in there that we want to do this by this time, or we want this to be happening by this time. Just like with climate change and everything that's coming with that. There's things that's happening now that's starting to move to take place with that. The towns all around here, they're trying to set up everything and setting goals of, we need to have this done by this period of time. We can't just keep, it's almost like kicking the can down the road. Take it to the next one. And
Actually, Joel, and I didn't want to overstate it either. The goals that are in there are not ultimate goals, they're rate goals.
yeah,
So you say if in this year or in this plan, right, there'll be X number more acres of this, that, other. And so we don't have anything that I'm aware of that said what the final state would be. I don't think even in the Spartina plan or the oyster plan, not the FMP, the plans, I don't think there's a final state. What does success look like? How many acres do you achieve and maintain through time? We don't,
Remember in the 2021 ship, we did that with SAB and we said 191,000 acres. And we put that number out there. What that means practically for the near term is a question, because the arrow is going the wrong way right now. And so, it's hard to approach it when you're like, all right, we got to stop the loss and then go back up. And so, I think that does lend itself to, we have a target, which is important.
and that one came from an extended period of time, right? It was,
Right, that was a collection of surveys dating back to 1980, 81.
okay. Joel.
Um,
And then to Sarah.
so this isn't, really fair to y'all. I just maybe want to say it because there's a record. And I also have a conflict of interest, so be aware of that. But it does seem to me that the Cruffle receipts were meant to support some of these types of activities, especially in the restoration context. And even the commercial fishing resource fund, I suppose, could, but certainly the Cruffle, when it used to have a habitat piece, and to the degree that those Cruffle monies appear to have been reallocated for other needs because of constraints that DMF feels, there's a real opportunity. There's a feeling of opportunity loss that we don't have those dollars to support some of these efforts to put some stuff back. I don't know if you could pass that on through the chip, that would be a wonderful thing to use those dollars for. If you could get the dollars to come back in from the state or something else.
That's a good note, Joel. Sarah?
Just been dealing so much with rulemaking and FMPs. Is it time to define like high salinity SAVs and low salinity SAV areas and give them their own FMPs? And work with them that way. If we don't have oysters, then pulling critters like oysters into an FMP like that might be a way of forcing ourselves to address the whole ecosystem management approach to fisheries.
So just for the record, in terms of keeping with the agenda, we have moved into the chip discussion in my view here. And frankly are headed towards the DORA discussion, which is going to interact very quickly. So let's take at least another 10 minutes or so here, and then I'm going to gently push us towards looking at how the deepwater oyster recovery areas illuminate some of these questions. Okay, so who is up?
So to answer Sarah's question, I think one bit that we're starting to explore, and Zach can probably give me more detail when I screw it up, but basically, DMFC has the ability to delegate proclamation authority for its FMPs. We currently don't have rulemaking set up to do that through the chip, but that is an avenue that we're exploring through this edition of the chip to try to make it, not necessarily where we have to have a SAV FMP equivalent, but use the chip at like equivalent to an FMP, and be able to do that make those actions and managements a little easier to tackle.
For what it's worth, and my memory now is foggy of the way the Fisheries Reform Act actually is worded, but under federal parlance, fish is anything that's not a mammal or a bird or so plants are fish. And in fact, I was involved in authoring and then helping have approved a sargassum fishery management plan with the South Atlantic Council that originally they proposed creating a phase out of an existing harvest. Actually, a gentleman here from Carteret County. But at the end of the day, it's all habitat. And even though we, in some places, have an embarrassment of excess habitat of that type in some people's view, nonetheless, the final analysis, and this was approved by Secretary of the Department of Commerce, was have a zero harvest standard for sargassum as a fish, but also as a habitat. And just one other thing, I keep putting this on the record, nobody wants to hear it, but remember that the Marine Fisheries Reform Act does not constrain us to deal with this ecosystem from a fisheries ecosystem, from a regulatory standpoint, species. It says any combination of species, gears, and areas. And so, my view, there is no reason that we couldn't do an Albemarle Sound fisheries multi-species plan, that we couldn't do a Pamlico Sound plan that would look at all the fisheries together and all the key habitats together and create bottom disturbing fisheries gear exclusion zones that cut across all of those. So, for instance, in our deepwater oyster recovery areas, those were established under the oyster plan, and that actually doesn't automatically cascade to other species. And so bottom disturbing gear, including shrimping, would still be allowable indoors the way it stands right now. Some people are greatly concerned about that. Well, depending on how the lawsuit goes, we'll see about that. But nonetheless, if you wanted to say, okay, what are like with SAVs, what are the elements of disturbance that we're able to address, fishing directly for shrimp in areas, and the staff brought us some really highly, in my view, excellent place-based management that would preclude bottom disturbing gear in shallow water in SAV habitat. And hopefully we'll see that again in Amendment 2 when it comes back to the commission. But another pathway would be to broaden that and look at actually all the shallow water oyster and clam, or even shell shell habitat, SAVs, deep water oyster habitats, and basically have a single map, unified map that would limit bottom disturbing fishing gear in the first instance, and then identify the other threats that needed to be remediated through other pathways. So the ones that could be addressed by the EMC, we could specifically request actions by the EMC. The CRC and P&A watersheds, for instance, we could request a revisitation of whether in fact the water quality standards that were necessary to support P&A. Once the P&As are designated that way, that becomes a beneficial use of those waters that have to be supported by water quality management. And then that cascades to the Coastal Resources Commission. But I don't think nobody's demanded action there and nobody sued them. So that hasn't happened. And anyway, you get my point. I think that we could do all of those. And I don't think as long as we chase our tail species by species around Pamlico Sound, I have a hard time seeing how we get to that final answer. Who else?
So picking up, Doug, in what you said, on these elements of disturbances, that does cascade to other species, based on the wonderful science that was even presented last year with the SAV, that did go up the ladder, but was turned down last summer by the State House here in Raleigh with the shrimp trawling, which was all about, although it was under the shrimp name, is all about, number one, the ecosystem-based management. And that's continuing to be destroyed. I mean, well, years ago, if you were swimming out in the ocean at dusk, you could almost be hit by the shrimp nets. And each year the ship seems to go further and further out. Now it's tough even to see them. You just see their light, working at night. And so what can be done to revisit this situation, which is step number one of the CHIP plan, and I think a great topic number one about the ecosystem and how we are continuing to destroy it. How can it build back when it's being taken away all the time?
Anybody else besides me? I mean, I'll give you my view.
I didn't mean to be looking.
Well, Sarah and I are commissioners and we vote on this stuff. So, and including on this. So, the shrimp amendment that I mentioned.
That was also for the SAV as well with the drilling.
So, if anybody else wants to take that, I mean, so the way it has stood so far is that the commission has mostly agreed and come close to voting in areas where bottom disturbing shrimping would not be allowed. And that was a pretty sophisticated and extensive network of nearshore SAV habitat. And yet we didn't have the votes, is the truth. At the last meeting, I don't know what it was. It was close, 5-4 kind of votes, which we rarely have. They're either 9-0 or 5-4, one way or the other. And so right now we don't have the votes given the way the commission is structured to prohibit all shrimp trawling in North Carolina. I'm not sure how I would vote, to tell you the truth, because I've worked on this in a lot of other places in the world, and I think there's some parts of Pamlico Sound where it might be okay. But right now we don't have that mechanism in place to look at it that way. But we have a commitment from the staff and direction from the commission to bring back to us for action, a consideration of what would need to be done to protect shallow water SAV habitat within the purview of the commission and not. And I'll just tell you, the one piece of the equation that we see as the hardest, but I say the hardest, if you disagree, tell me, is boat prop scarring, which is pretty considerable on the inside of the Outer Banks. And none of the three commissions caught in the chip have the authority, at least not so far as we know yet. Is that right? We can manage fishing props, but we can't manage recreational boat props. But they're going to bring back to us, ideas about that in subsequent meetings. Disagree with any of that? Okay, I'm not putting you on the spot. Well, maybe I am, but I don't mean to.
Yeah,
Charlie?
the boat platform winds up being very, there's some roundabout ways to kind of get at it. Zach's been working on delineating exactly whose authority, what bits of something like that might fall under, what's wildlife, what's us, what's.
Yeah, it might be the Wildlife Commission, but remember, Wildlife Commission were left out in the original law of the CHIP responsibility and authority.
Two more things. One on this exact subject. So as a recreational boater, and we have Captain Scott here to really be behind us, you're responsible for your wake. Hence, if you're in a no wake zone and you perform a wake and it hurts the vegetation or the wildlife or another boater or whatever, you're responsible for that wake. So under that same regulation, can't you also be responsible for, plowing the,
Whose regulation is that? I don't know.
Yeah, so it would be, right, like you're responsible for damage caused by your boat is essentially like, your wake has an impact on someone, then that comes back to you.
or the environment?
Yeah, or the environment. And so what we've kind of circled around is there a way to look at, Marine Patrol sees you out there doing something reckless or unnecessary that damages the grass bed,
Right now, I can offer this up. So if you damage someone's vessel or someone, there is a complainant. So right now, if you damage the bottom, there is no complainant. And that's something that the CHIP could potentially define.
Is the recourse in the courts, or is the recourse citation from the Marine Patrol? Or
the direction we've thought about it is if the MFC was to say, like, pass a rule saying no reckless destruction of SAV, I don't quote me on that phrasing, but something to that regard.
But if you're
The
international,
Marine Patrol could issue a citation.
it's federal, and
It's
they will
written.
write you a ticket,
Yeah, there it's written.
because it is a federal law.
West Florida has a lot of experience on corals analogous to that.
Some of the best SAV beds that we have at least in the northern Outer Banks, the high salinity SAV beds fall within the National Wildlife Refuge boundary. So
And I was in Florida for a long time and, the
Oh, yeah.
problem you have is the enforcement of, you can't see it from the surface, you can only see it from above. So the actual enforcement upon the recreational boat or even the commercial vessel, it's very hard to pin down unless the boat ran up into it and ran aground. There's the,
And Marine Patrol was right there looking at it.
right,
Yeah.
it's increasingly hard to enforce.
Which is,
So they've tightened up a lot on it. The FWC will write you a $500 ticket if they catch you grounded and you ran through a seabed. It's $500 right there on the spot. And they do it all the time,
The regulation is already there.
federally, but it is not in North Carolina.
Federally.
Right.
Yeah, so maybe that is something that North Carolina,
well, you guys, I hope will bring this back to us as you can, because this is one of the things that's in the queue for them to recommend to us.
Right. I don't know that you'll get this as a rulemaking option through this chip, but this discussion will come to you through this edition of the chip, and there'll be a proper info paper on this issue.
But in addition, the commission's expecting it as part of the response to the shrimp amendment situation.
We're trying to make that, merge that with the chip and make it one thing.
I understand,
Well,
but
yes,
but we'll,
we have an obligation to do that.
yeah, we expect it regardless.
Can I
So-
give you a comment on that?
Please.
As a holding a commercial license for 50 years. Part of the problem with that last year was more ignorance than anything. Because most commercial fishermen saw that as, you're gonna take all my nets. You're not gonna let me skim, you're not gonna let me do anything. And I was in Florida 30-something years ago when they bought everybody's nets up. Now, I had 1,000 yards of gill nets at one time. Back then I got rid of them because I saw what the change in Florida because of what the gill net was doing. You couldn't catch a trout anywhere in the state at the time. Now, no problem. But they see it as that factor that wasn't explained to a lot of them. And for a lot of them, because they knew I'm on this advisory committee, come and said, like my guns, you're not taking my nets. You're not gonna tell me I can't trawl anymore. But most of them would agree to skimming. But in somewhere it got into the fact, well, if you take the trawls, you're taking skimmers, you're taking everything. So that was the biggest problem with most people that fought it. Because they saw it as you're taking my rights. And the word that one taught me, the dead daughters will come here and they're taking everything we got. And in the future, I think, people realize, that the situation is dire. We've got to do something about it. But don't just blanket the whole thing and say, is it shrimp trawling and everything like that? Because I can tell you, right out here in Bugstown where I grew up, trawling was never in the shallows. Nobody wanted to trawl in the shallows because there's too much grass. What killed the grass is salinity and pH. But everybody turns around and says, trawling there. We haven't trawled sounds 25 years. But it's like a desert now.
And I think the vast majority of the areas that had been identified by staff were those non-conflict areas. I don't know if you agree with that, Sarah, but that's sure what it looked like to me. There were a few points of concern about where point to point edges bothered some people that I think we could have and now could adjust to deal with those. But there was also an equitability argument about, you come after the fishing part of this loss when some large, but maybe unknown contribution coming from non-fishing threats, including props and development and other things, are not being addressed. And it just didn't seem fair to do that, which we agree with, but I shouldn't say that. I agree with it. But I'm fairly sure the commission agrees with it. But the way that this works is to use the chip as a mechanism to cascade it over to the EMC and the CRC. And we need somebody to be able to come up with what the approach would be that would mitigate those threats. How are you going to adjust bulkheading and coastal development density and impervious pavement use and all the things that go into the CRC rules in order to mitigate those threats? And we definitely need help figuring out whether there's an approach that is a win-win there. I don't know. Go ahead.
Charlie, you mentioned a couple of your partners, North Carolina Coastal Federation, Nature Conservancy, and you also were making some comparisons to what Virginia did, especially on the Chesapeake. I'd like to recommend or suggest maybe another partner. I know Virginia, especially through the Chesapeake area and all its tributaries, relied a lot on the river keepers. And that's something that you may wish to consider, as they have a lot of data. I know that that might be a source for North Carolina as well. The river keepers. Right. So just a suggestion.
Okay, I'm not trying to stop this, but let's move on if we can to make sure that that you are adequately briefed on where the DORA question stands, because I think it's pretty important for the commission to hear back from this group about where we're going with it. Would you take a minute, Charlie, and just offhand do that?
I'll respond to that, and then I think Zach is gonna hop in with some DORA thoughts. So you wanna come on up here? But yeah, the Riverkeepers are a valuable partner. I mean, we lost Lisa, but they've volunteered to help us. And when it comes to collecting clarity data for enforcing this standard, part of the thought is water resources staff are strapped for, they've lost positions, they keep positions full, but keepers are out there every day collecting water samples and measuring water quality. So really good partners to bring in, and that's a good reminder to us to keep.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
So at the request of the commission for this previous meeting in February, we're requested to basically create a memo that's talking about the possibility of permitting what we kind of deemed for simplicity as overplanting or planting mulch or sanctuary or some kind of material on top of the existing rocks within DORAs. And so I do totally understand your comment that was at the February commission meeting of you somewhat expected us to delve into much more of kind of how this fits in with the chip. Though, given the turnaround and trying to coordinate with Army Corps, the goal was to basically get as much information about permitting as possible. But I do think some of that is some of the discussion, just to kind of primer it for y'all, is that the original intention of this was to understand what does natural recovery look like, to then understand and at the next iteration of the FMP be able to evaluate, is that something that needs to continue on? Is that something that needs to be addressed additionally? What do those pieces look like? Because these deep water areas within the DORAs and these reefs, we don't have a lot of direct data on what recovery could possibly look like and what that natural recovery and accretion rate could be, and getting an idea of what an annual accretion rate can equivalent to on the scale of getting to a level that's outside of that hypoxia, and let alone is being able to then evaluate, is hypoxia truly that main driver? So getting a baseline was the original goal of that FMP. And then since then, to just try to briefly summarize the memo is what we got out of that is there is potential avenue, but the amount of work that we would need to do to evaluate, would this be successful? How can we prove to NIMS and Army Corps, who would have to require that, how we could potentially be successful and provide their functional uplift? And then we also have the considerations of, we don't have the additional funding because it'd be excessively expensive. And then what my programs on the enhancement side of our section work on is really an evaluation of the overall kind of oyster equation for the state. As if we have a given amount of funding that we're able to utilize every year, what is the maximum oyster output we can get out of that gear, as opposed to how can we use the most of that money to benefit one particular region. And so that's why the oyster FMP was split in that threefold objective that really valued habitat, fishery, and kind of the equivalent, like the equal value of those. And we were not, by taking away temporarily the DORA areas, we're also dedicating ourselves to replacing some portion of that through these rotational harvest management sites that are these large 10-acre sites that we're building multiple a year to allow those for additional fishing opportunity. So there is some balance there. I'm not saying it's completely even, but the goal being we're providing some balance back out of it. And so that's kind of where the baseline of that FMP strategy was coming from. And so the next step for y'all to kind of discuss and for us to discuss, and really I think the best piece for the advisory committees and for the commission itself is to start thinking through what next steps and what pieces that the commission will want to work through on the next iteration.
Thanks, Dan. And so the reason that I and actually several commissioners were pushing back on that is that if you look at the, again, I'll use the word habitat provisioning across the system and look at where the weak spots are, maybe the weakest spots, at least in my view, as a scientist, those habitats in the central part of the sound are among the very weakest. And so, and in fact, it's not a matter of going down, they're largely gone. And so with a whole set of cascading consequences that I don't think we can quantitate, but nonetheless are serious. And so the flip side of that is that we actually didn't expect the division to be able to say, the Division of Marine Fisheries in North Carolina could by itself bring back the 1880s or 1860s in terms of fully provisioning high relief habitats that provide key habitat for juvenile fish as they move through their life cycles. And so, given that the division could not do that, what we're interested in seeing is what the trajectory, plural, might look like to begin that process, given that that's where we were on shallow water oysters, and that's where we were on Spartina, and that's where we were on really all of seagrasses and all those things, recognizing that it's going to take years, decades, partnerships with other state and federal agencies, public-private partnerships, the same way that private money has spilled heavily into the shallow water oyster recovery programs and seagrass programs and Spartina programs around the country, really. And so I think it's important, I think it's critically important, and I would say in the CHIP, to lay out what the current context is and what those pathways might be. And so, for instance, the CHIP itself is also just an instrument of these three commissions, and that by itself is grossly inadequate to begin a quest like that, which would require a concerted engagement, state, federal, private engagement through time. And so, I think there's no alternative to lay out what that pathway might look like. And probably APNEP, the Albemarle Pamlico National Estuary Program. Now they did just adopt their comprehensive conservation management plan, but among us in some haste because of the way things were changing and how fast things were changing. And so there wasn't really a good opportunity to bring these kinds of things into it. But I'd be really surprised in the longer term if the National Estuary Program generally, and all the agencies, state and federal agencies and private partnerships that exist there, wouldn't be really interested. I'd be shocked if the non-governmental organizations wouldn't be really interested in trying to re-provision a critically missing habitat in estuaries like this. But it's not going to happen this week. It might not happen in my lifetime, but that's where the other thing started. That's actually the piece that I wasn't happy about, was that instead of saying we can't do it for these reasons, I'm more interested in laying out what the pathway to success might require and look like, and where the funding might ultimately come from, and how you would go about solving key science. So I did not mean to preach at you at all, but Sarah, and then please join in.
Well, my question would be, because there's so many different layers of regulations to this, before that even gets started, realistically, what depth are we looking at right now where oysters are surviving? How deep? It seems like in reading about the Doras and reading about some of the deeper water oyster, the natural reefs that are out there, that once you get these major hurricane events and bottom disturbances like that, you lose everything that you've gained. So is this a good way? If this was an option, is it a good option to even go to go forward with deep water? Or is there anybody studying in North Carolina realistically?
Dave Eggleston, his group get to these places.
I don't know if they've done specifically these deep
Yeah.
water ones.
The Peterson lab did, but I don't think anything much happened after that. My memory of those papers is that they showed that, again, that the critical factor was getting the habitat up off the bottom to provide the protection at the same time surviving bottom water anoxia events as they happen. And of course, roughness elements in the ocean like that can both disturb and make more stable the sediments within and around them. So there's a set of scaling issues and a set of height off the bottom, roughness issues that have to be understood better. And I fear, especially with shrimp trawling continuing to be allowed in these zones, that you'd be hard pressed to see much, as things stand.
To try to answer Sarah's question a little bit, I'm glancing back through some of the data sources that went into the DORA document, and it was 4.5 meters depth. So that was generally safe. You generally didn't see hypoxia impacts shallower than 4.5 meters. That data points 4.5 to 5.5. You saw impacts, and below 5.5, you saw almost 100% mortality from hypoxia hypoxia events.
And what's the depth profile across the sites? Has there been identified?
I believe, on average, I want to say they're somewhere between 18 to 22 feet or something along those lines. So yeah, right at,
I drew followed roughly the 5-meter contour.
Yeah.
Was the rough guiding line.
So almost by definition, unless we get vertical relief on those sites, it's going to be very iffy. Is that fair?
yeah, and I think a tricky part with having to express that in the FMP of like the intricacies of hypoxia, as a lot of people here know better than me, is that those events don't necessarily always occur as a blanket over everything. There are pieces and anecdotally through, some of our staff's diving on these sites and my own diving on some of our oyster sanctuary sites, some of our natural sites is seeing, differing lines across different years of those effects. And so that could be, major events that wipe out all of them. But, we also sampled before and after Hurricane Florence at one of our oyster sanctuaries to see the potential effect. And one of the major things we saw was granted it was in that season, but it induced a spawning event slightly earlier than usual as almost a response potentially to that major stressor or something along those lines. So that was a tricky part, is the mixed potential hypoxia, because we had some outliers. I believe Bennett mentioned it at our shellfish crustacean meeting last night, is somewhere on the order of 490 oysters per meter squared on a couple of these DORA sites, and then some that were significant. That was an outlier, but a lot of them were significantly lower. But that does show that there's high variability in some of the existing relief, some of the existing success in oysters, and just what these rocks look like. Because some of these that we've scanned are on the order of 50 acres of rock. So there's a lot to it. It's not necessarily that every single year there is a blanket of killing everything, though there certainly could be. And that's the difficult part, to try and evaluate it in what a vacuum can occur within an oyster FMP. So that's the other tricky part, is that in addressing an oyster FMP, where the commission is bound to restrictions to the oyster fishery. It's in the rule that it's the restrictions that can be occurring in 03K or 201 is that those are particular to oyster fishing gears. And so at that moment, that is what the FMP, can prescribe.
And the same is true for the shrimp amendment for SAVs, and on you go. I do think that there's a value in delineating the sites or areas and identifying the beneficial use of those, because that then creates the potential for follow-on engagement, either regulatory or non-regulatory engagement, including investments. Because otherwise, why would you invest anything if it was likely to be wiped out? But also, in my view, at least highlights the need for multi-species planning when it comes to habitat, and that we are going to be behind the 8 ball on every one of these FMPs, and particularly really now that the oyster and hard clam FMPs have been adopted, and the shrimp amendment will, when it comes, if it comes, will be relatively narrow, looking at SAV habitat issues related to shrimp, then it really begs the question about whether we do need a habitat FMP, which we can do. Maybe we totally can do a every fishery in Pamlico Sound could be addressed through a standalone FMP.
I think I just missed an important memo. So from a regulatory perspective, how come you can't try one of these as just the next oyster sanctuary?
Well, and we also have one or two, I'd have to look at the boundary. We already have a sanctuary within the Door site that was a lot of our understanding originally is Little Creek Oyster Sanctuary that has a solid line across it of, you know, hypoxic death, and then everything above it exists. So that's certainly, you know, not outside the realm of the possibility. That factors into, you know, what our oyster sanctuary goals and that being prescribed in different laws as where that funding is coming from and what the goal of that is to be spat source to drive a lot of the oyster growth in the sound. You know, it's a pivot of what the goal of an oyster
The
sanctuary.
oyster sanctuary program is still predicated upon spawning sanctuary language.
Yeah, because that was the original
Yeah.
Gene Preston Sanctuary Network was the goal to provide a spat network that then is seeding the entirety of Pamlico Sound, which is how it's working. And we've gotten, you know, data back that 70% of spat in the Pamlico Sound is sourced from, and, you know, within.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, big error bars.
Scott,
Ignorance. For those of us that aren't as plugged in, could you please provide a 2-minute definition of what deepwater oyster recovery areas are? Like, and why we're having this overall discussion. So I'm sorry about my ignorance on that.
Oh, no, sorry that we didn't give you appropriate backup here.
Yeah.
So with the last edition of the Oyster FMP, that's where this issue came from. Rewinding about 30 years, in the 90s, there was research in the Peterson lab at UNC, looking at the impacts of hypoxia, low dissolved oxygen on the reefs in Pamlico Sound. That was in partnership with DMF. They did some measurements of mortality on natural reefs. They constructed some reefs and looked at mortality on them, and basically found that for the hypoxic waters are going to be on the bottom. And so you would have these, after a big storm comes through, big plume of fresh water comes through, all the oxygen gets used up. You'd have these periods of a few days or even longer that there just wouldn't be any oxygen for the oysters on the bottom. And so you'd have losses of, if a reef was tall enough to get out of it, the bottom half, maybe the oysters would all be dead and all the crab and stuff would have had to climb to the top to survive. If it was too shallow and it was below that hypoxic layer, everything would die. And there was complementary research that
All the oysters would die and the animals would have to flee.
yes, and if you were non-mobile, then you would also. So additional research followed up on that, connected the impacts of oyster dredging, basically found that oyster dredging over time would grind those mountains down, and found that in some of those deeper areas that it would grind them below the level that would then be hit by those hypoxic events. And so if it's been ground down that low and you have hypoxia happening too much, the oyster reef has some ability to grow back up on its own. But basically this was the combination of dredging and hypoxic events were preventing the reefs from recovering elevation. So the goal then of passing the deepwater oyster recovery areas was to give those reefs a break from dredging and allow them to start to naturally regain a little bit of height on their own.
Gotcha. Thank you.
was a question in limbo about when and if oystering would be allowed. But again, it was still done under the context of oyster production management through the FMP.
And it was going to be difficult because it's not like oyster reef growth, they're not going to gain 3 feet over the course of a few years.
Right.
And these are areas that are growing, they're experiencing hypoxia already. So that's going to further slow their growth over time. So we're working with a relatively slow rate of recovery, but one that's also very difficult to quantify.
Just for what it's worth, I mean, if you look at what we know about what the sounds looked like in the 1880s and before, there were abundant high relief oyster reefs there that many of us believe were integral to the productivity of the system at that time. I think that's a key habitat that's largely eliminated. Hypoxia has always been here, right? It's just been exacerbated.
Doug, if you don't mind,
Lisa Ryder had to go. She had another prior commitment at 7 o'clock, but she actually emailed a few questions
Okay.
before the meeting. And I think one of them would kind of get us a little bit further into the conversation. I'll kind of shorten it a little bit. So basically the question she has is what monitoring is currently underway or at least planned for the DORAs that were adopted by the commission? And is there any plans to make that publicly available, that monitoring?
Yeah, so we have surveys that are side scan sonar and multi-beam bathymetry. We've done one survey to kind of delineate and capture the reefs as they exist as the baseline. That survey vote is functioning off of support fish restoration grants and other commitments that we have to us, including keep up with rotational harvest management portions of this FMP and other work we have. So our kind of commitment is at least the initial survey and a survey at the end of that, or close to the end of that 5-year iteration period, so we can get some evaluation. The other piece is that while we have, at times, potentially centimeter level survey scale or resolution, that is still, controlling a lot of the factors of the water moving the boat makes it to where if we were to do annually, it's not necessarily going to pick up a difference at that scale. It's very difficult to control those environmental factors that are shifting a boat while taking, bathymetric surveys. So it's not necessarily, if we could do it every month, we would be getting better data than that. We're also conducting yearly scuba surveys that are integrated into our current scuba surveys. And then the biggest piece with those is, of course, this is all kind of extra work added into an existing workload within this staff. So it's as we're able to, and we're able to fit the surveys, the scuba surveys in a little easier. So that's less, technology, weather, staffing, funding driven of a question as bathymetric surveying is. And so to her question, I think was about also water quality. We don't have a capability or capacity to do anything more than YSI readings while we're at those sites currently. We did previously have, some funding that allowed for water quality sonde monitoring, and we did so to get some profiles of different oyster sanctuaries and representative pieces around the sound and other parts of the state. But the hard part with that, and those have now aged out and now are obsolete and no longer kind of functional. So that's would have to be an additional effort of both funding and people to be able to manage that. As if more intense water quality monitoring would be, a sizable effort. We have been trying to delve into what analogs or other available water quality monitoring that exists we could tap into to get some idea of, metrics we can follow along with the surveys that we're able to pull in. So that's where we're at currently with monitoring.
I think it would be helpful to know what, I won't say ideal because you never get your ideal, but what a well-resourced monitoring program would look like so that we can cost it and then go to the sources, including the General Assembly, but also others, including private sources. So it would be, and for that matter, APNEP. If we are going to take deeper water oyster reef as a critical habitat that requires investment to provision, then we need to know what that is and seek their concurrence and an agreement with partners to pursue that. I don't know what it would look like, so if you could help us understand that, I think it would be useful.
Well, one of the priorities for the division for the last few years has been a coastal habitat assessment program, which would basically be scientists to go along with Charlie's side of the house to be working on habitat specific data collection and efforts like that. So that this, I think, could be something that could fit along with that. But, unfortunately, we don't always get our priorities funded. So.
Right, but of course, APNEP, at least assuming the national Section 319 and Section 320 of the Clean Water Act still exists, in years to come. Yeah, I think there's a potential to really energize a process like this here and other places. But somebody has to start to get the ball rolling, and I just think we're at the time and place to do that. And that's the way, at least I see the action by the commission, is getting the ball rolling on that quest. So we're running close on time. Are there other questions on DORAs or on the chip process that you've been briefed on
Yeah.
today?
Quick question. What is the ultimate goal in the end? I mean, is it just species recovery or is it market recovery? And of course, you know, since the beginning of time, Pamlico Sound stratifies every year and kills off everything. And I've seen some of the doors located there and everything, but you know, you're beating a dead horse there. That's all there's to it. It's not gonna survive because the buildup of, hypoxia and everything, because it stratifies and anaerobics and everything of it take over. And it kills the oysters. You look at Chesapeake Bay, everybody talks about Chesapeake and oystering there. That's because it's moving water. It stays stirred the whole time. The oysters, what's have suffered up there has been for the viruses and everything, which come from everything else. But like I said, my question is, are you trying to get this where it makes it a marketable product again? Or are you just trying to get a recovery species? Because my wife's family is from northern Spain. They gave up on this a long time ago, 50 years ago. Everything now, deep water oysters and everything are all raised on roads that they harvest constantly. And it does very well because they could not, between the siltation and the hypoxia, they could not recover from it. So now everything is, and that's the, and I hate to say this, as being a commercial fisherman as I was, mariculture is a common thing no matter what. I mean, I'm sorry, but we're the last ones to do it. When I was at ECU, we were trying to push on it and everything like that. And we pushed it over to everywhere else besides ourselves. But that's why, I mean, I want to see the species recover and everything. But on the other side of it, you know, are we doing it just to say, I can go out there and tong oysters, or I can go out there and dredge oysters? Because that's become something that's going to be a thing of the past.
When we proposed the DORAs, the goal was to be able to eventually reopen harvest. I don't know,
Yeah,
the
but you
timeframe
get that-
that will take with the economics of the fishery and the trends in what's going towards aquaculture and that kind of thing. We'll see what that piece looks like once we get the doors to a place they can reopen. But the goal was to eventually be able to reopen these areas. to
Well, you
harvest.
get in that endless cycle though. You build it up, it gets overfished. You just go back into it again, it gets overfished again. I mean, the fin fish and everything here, the same situation.
I think that's true in the context of the oyster fishery management plan, but it might not be true in terms of the habitat questions and whether there is a potential to restore a key habitat. And I think we need to know that. We don't know it yet, but once we know it, then to be able to scale how much is required. And so that's why I think this is actually generationally important.
I agree.
And if the goal really is just economic or just oyster production, then you're nearly certainly right that shellfish, mariculture, or different types is the faster way to do it. Although there's conflicts there too, because there's limited amount of appropriate depth areas and conflicts for those. So we hear a lot about that. And frankly, between boat prop scarring on seagrasses around those leases. So it gets really, really complicated. But this is my view, and the reason I voted for it was actually was outside of the context of oyster species production, economic production, but because of this deficiency in the habitat mosaic.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Might make a comment.
Please.
In our state magazine this past month or either last month, I don't know, there was a very good article in there about the new river in Onslow County, how they had spent 25 years and they had declared that river restored.
I didn't see that. I'll have to go back and see it.
Well, it's a good read. And it made me think that an oyster is the wonder drug for all of it, especially the water clarity. You know, the water's polluted, period. And it just seems like to me the oyster's the wonder fix for water quality.
Definitely there's some scale issues there that need to be looked at for sure, but that's clearly what people think in terms of filtration capabilities and pollutant loading for certain things and that kind of stuff.
You get a chance,
I'll go back and read that.
look at
I hope everybody will.
our state magazine and read that article.
We're narrowing in on the end of the meeting, and you have an opportunity now on the agenda to raise other issues that you would like to, either questions for staff, or if you want to just get things on the table for potential future meetings.
This will just be related to what we're talking about in that, yeah, not to be too fringe lunatic, but to go the other way, we have intertidal oysteries in North Carolina. And as a habitat that has multiple services and is not as related to the fishery because of the form of the oysters, there's a huge opportunity to try to restore intertidal oyster reefs. And if you go back to those Winslow maps from the 1880s, for instance, the Shell Castle area, I mean, there were, if you believe those maps, there were 1.5 kilometer long oyster reefs. You know, and let's say those maps are wrong. So let's say they're 300 or 400 yards long. There's big oyster reefs. I mean, Shell Castle's changing, and we may be at the end of a window to try to do something there. And we know that if done in the right environments, that you can get, you know, thousands of oysters per meter squared in an intertidal reef. Now, that's not to say they're not subject to hurricanes and stressors too. They are. But I don't know, I'm always an advocate for thinking about intertidal reefs.
So just to that point, and to put you at ease, that's one of those points that has been on our list for a while now, especially on the enhancement side of my section, but I think fits well with the leasing side, which is also my section. So all the hate that we get, don't worry, I have to deal with that all the time. And then Charlie's portion is I think that fits really well, but we're hindered by the fact that the hardest part with moving down south is Charlie sort of leads, it's kind of bleeds over, but our estuarine benthic habitat mapping program to try and map a lot of that intertidal oyster presence along with SAV and marshland in the southern portion of the region. But then that's also a big goal of our restoration efforts and enhancement for mulch planting and otherwise in the southern portion of the state, the issue there being stockpile sites. So, which Scott, you know firsthand, but the best thing we can do currently is load our Oyster Creek, our biggest boat we have at TLZ Bluebird and New River, and steam all the way down and have a day to 3 days worth of planting that we're giving to smaller boats and then rinse and repeat. So that's obviously a very inefficient way to plant in those areas, to go all the way down to Lehigh, Taft, or even to Wilmington coming from New River. So that's our most effective way currently, because real estate in Wilmington is very expensive. So logistically is what's kind of sitting in our path, or the obstacles in our path. But I totally agree. And that EBHM, the habitat mapping that's primarily drone and ground truthing, can also work with our enhancement folks who are species leads to then try and feed into a stock assessment, because that's the piece we know even more or even less about is, you know, how many oysters are in that intertidal region in the southern portion of the state. And so it is all something that we're kind of pulling together, but restoration effort and understanding those pieces is such a big piece to tackle, especially from how do we do this with limited funding, and limited being, you know, we get a good amount of funding to put rock in the water. But when you're talking about increasing diesel prices every year and steaming a 130-foot vessel down to then run 2 other vessels off of it, you know, that funding runs out pretty quickly. So I totally agree, and that's something, if anybody has real estate they're looking to give up in Riceville Beach, we'll take it, but until then, we're kind of hamstrung to only a certain amount, though the reception has been, this is the first time we've planted in, the southern region in the last like 20 years. The past couple of years we've been doing it, we've gotten nothing but, great responses out of it and a lot of growth. So that is a piece to evaluate. It's just, we don't quite have the power we want to be able to do it.
And moving back to the earlier point, I mean, I would personally love to see a map and some numbers about what long-term what success looks like. So if your annual rate, is that a down payment? Is that the rate that needs to be? Would it take 30 years at that rate to get where we want to go, or is that continual forever? Or, I mean, I just don't know from the FMP. Anyway, I'd love to see that, a goal. So we're out of time, but other ideas, burning things that you've observed or you'd like to get on in the list for us to bring up next time?
Go ahead, Mark.
With not enough O2 getting deep enough, with not enough light getting deep enough. And I know I'd mentioned this a while back, that one of the problems could easily be nutrient runoff due to hog farms upstream of the ocean, of the bays, of the sounds, and even of the rivers, because of their reservoirs that are sadly old school reservoirs that have not been updated because politics and I guess regulations not passing. But if we look at what goes on upstream, that may help all of the issues or make a contributory factor towards those issues. It's interesting that the aquarium at PKS, it's not like other aquariums. Where do they start? Well, there's a waterfall, there's a little creek, goes into a stream, goes into a river, and same thing with these nutrient organic runoffs. So much is coming from the hog farms, and it's a tough battle, especially in North Carolina, to deal with, but it would be interesting to see more finger pointing from DMF to what's happening upstream. And that may go to assisting in solving some of our problems downstream, if that makes any sense.
I just got 2 points and no discussion needed. It's just something that, for like the CHIP and for our future plans. I would love to see a North Carolina definition of wetlands, uplands, and an identification of where they are, because it's not a universal definition across the different areas. I think that's something for note. And then the other one is I'd love to see mitigation strategies for development. Ties in with that definition and identification of where wetlands are. So if where we are today, a new subdivision is being built, what mitigation could be required by law or policy for, hey, you put in a pier, a launch ramp, whatever this public, subdivision tile access is, what is going to be required? You just entered into the public trust, you damaged the public trust. What should be required of that stakeholder to maybe pay back, to restore a little bit, to mitigate that damage they did?
Good ideas for revisiting. I think that particularly the wetland question, particularly at the watershed scale, is one that we're flailing at right now with the determination by the Supreme Court and also by our legislature, basically to require contiguity as part of the definition. It's contiguity with surface waters as part of the definition for wetlands that lead to delineation and regulation. So all those manuals and other things that implement all that stuff are in flux, right? Still, yeah. And so we don't know, but I'll just tell you what the direction is, and that is that there'll be less water detained and retained on the landscape, less denitrification, more delivery of nitrogen and other materials, including sediments, as those lands then are developed. can't hold water anymore. So I don't know that anybody has actually looked at the scale of a watershed and what would happen if that change in definition, legal definitions, were then fully exerted on a landscape at scale. It worries me greatly. And then pick up on something that Joel had said before, that the other thing that I hear from the scientists is that are out in the water is a market change in primary nursery areas, secondary nursery areas, and other places that are that are now like with flocculent mud on the bottom, which has got to be coming from the watershed and obviously interacting with the salinity differences in place. I think that's remains a big unknown about what the aggregate and cumulative effect of development in those watersheds is having, and we don't really have a mechanism that I'm aware to think about how to constrain that. So anyway, I'd love to have those things back on the table at some point. Anybody else? Okay, seeing no other comments, thanks for your time. Wonderful discussion. I really,
Doug, can I just mention one
Please.
thing about the next meeting? So your next meeting is scheduled tentatively for June 17th. We don't currently have an agenda item for that meeting, but I've talked with the Marine Fisheries Commission Chairman. He is very hopeful that we'll actually have more meetings more frequently and maybe not go quite so long as we did in between previous meetings. So we should be having that meeting in June. It's again, June 7th. It likely will be here in the Central District office again. But if the committee members would like to see us kind of move around some, that's something we can absolutely do. Also, that's just kind of a conveniently located spot.
will there be documents chip-wise at that point, or that's too early, right?
I'll look at the calendar. We might be able to get you something. I don't know I don't know the level of reach out.
Plan. And so if we would be looking at the next one would be when, September or October?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so that would be the one we really dedicate to digging into the documents, I think. Sarah?
With that said, I'd love to see how the chip process is playing out with the collaboratory report. What kind of grade is it getting? Where is it doing well? Where is it not doing well? How can it be strengthened? I'd love to talk about that.
Report. Went into a good bit of detail on that. So we could certainly bring that one up.
So we'll hear generally in May, but it'd be interesting in the June meeting, then to actually dig into the habitat and ecosystem side of the recommendations. If that's possible, Joel.
So this sounds like code, sorry. Some academics finished a 3-year study, kind of just taking a status of where our fisheries and habitats are. And so we submitted that report early this year. So there's a big report that kind of looks at where we are, make recommendations that could, perhaps be considered to affect management in some hopefully positive way.
There's a whole bunch of charts that have arrows like the ones that Charlie showed before about trend lines for a lot of important things, like phosphorus loading being down and nitrogen loading being up, and lots of things like that.
And if the committee would like to see that report, it's publicly available online, but I'd be happy to email out links to everyone with that information as well.
It's a beastie. So yeah, if you don't mind doing that, that'd be great, Jesse. Thank you.
Great.
Anybody else last comments? Again, thanks for your time, and we look forward. I think we're going to have an interesting process this year to dig into some of this. So thank you. Meeting's adjourned. Be safe on the way home, wherever that is.
How you doing, man? Good, good.